Welcome to Music Student 101. For study aids and examples, feel free to follow along on our website, musicstudent101.com.
All right, so I'd like to talk about some of the basics of rhythm for a second here. The idea of rhythm is very closely tied to the idea of pulse. So in almost all music, there is a pulse. This is what you're tapping your foot to or nodding your head. You know, if you're nodding along, head banging, whatever. The idea of this steady pulse that is available in all music, just this being that something is happening at very regular intervals through the entire thing. So we use different notes to signify how many beats of that pulse they should occupy. For example, a whole note is a whole measure in 4/4 time. It is generally the longest note used. It generally occupies 4 of those beats. 1, 2, 3, 4. So a whole note will be a note sustained for that period of time. Like that. Now, from there, we begin dividing these notes to get things that don't last so long. So each note is divided into 2. The whole note is divided into 2, and we have 2 half notes. And those 2 half notes generally last for 2 of those pulses. Each one is half the length of a whole note. Like that. We can divide those further into quarter notes, which is sort of the basic unit of time. And from here, it gets a little tricky. We can then divide a quarter note into 2 eighth notes, and there would be 2 of those notes for every pulse. So obviously there are 2 half notes in a whole note. There are 2 quarter notes in a half note. So there are 4 quarter notes in a whole note. 2 eighth notes in a quarter, 4 eighth notes in a half, 8 eighth notes in a whole. It's just like your fractions you learned in 3rd grade math. And also every one of these notes has a corresponding rest. And these rests do the same thing as the notes. So there's a whole rest, a half rest, a quarter rest, an eighth rest, and so on. And they take up the same amount of time as their corresponding notes. They just take up that amount of time in silence. So when you see a rest on a score, for example, that'll mean play nothing or sing nothing. Dotted notes, when you see a dotted note on a piece of music, you are going to add half of the note you normally would. So for a quarter note, if you put a dot beside it and make it a dotted quarter note, then that note is not only going to last for the length of the quarter note, but it's going to last 1/8 note after that. So another half of that note value. A dotted half note will last for a half note plus another quarter note. Right? Very simple. So dotted quarter note. And notice I stopped halfway between one beat and the next because that dotted quarter note is lasting a quarter note and then halfway into the next one. Dotted half note. Like that. So basically just 3 quarter notes. So we organize these pulses into patterns of beats by means of stressed and unstressed pulses, by means of accents. This is what gives rise to the idea of meter. So when you hear musicians talking about a bar or a measure, these things basically represent one repetition of this stressed and unstressed pattern. In a meter signature, the top note, or the first note, if somebody's just saying it, represents the number of beats, the number of those pulses that is in that pattern, whereas the bottom number represents which note value actually gets that beat. For example, in 2/4, we have 2 beats in our pattern, and those beats represent quarter notes, and our pattern is going to simply just be stressed followed by unstressed. Since we only have 2 beats in our pattern, then we only have two possibilities. So in this example, the stressed beat will be the kick drum, and the unstressed will be the snare. That's 2/4. Notice because we only have 2 beats, we can only do stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed. The pattern has to be something that can be repeated. So, and each of those beats, because we're in 2/4, what that 4 means is that it is quarter notes that get the beat. So the kick drum was a quarter note, the snare drum is a quarter note. If we had been in 2/2, for example, then the kick drum would have been a half note, and the snare drum would have been a half note. So just sort of a hierarchical thing going on. Another common pattern, 3/4, which is a stressed beat followed by 2 unstressed beats. And here's an example of that. In this case, the bass drum is the stressed beat, and the hi-hat will be the unstressed. All right, notice again, a simple pattern, repeating over and over again. We've just used stressed, unstressed, unstressed to group this pattern of beats together. The most common time signature in a lot of music, 4/4, stressed beat, followed by an unstressed beat, followed by a slightly stressed beat, and then an unstressed beat. So you get a pattern of 4. Here we'll have the kick drum as always being the stressed, the hi-hat being both the unstressed, and the snare can be the slightly stressed. All right, so stressed, unstressed, slightly stressed, unstressed, 4/4 time. All right, so normally we divide these beats into 2, such as 2/4, 3/4, 4/4. Beat division is what makes music happen. So if we were thinking of counting in 4/4, if we were thinking of counting our beats 1, 2, 3, 4, if we wanted to divide each of those beats by 2, we would have 8 eighth notes, and you can think of that as sounding sort of like 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. If you wanted to then divide all of those eighth notes into 2 and have 16th notes, then you would have something that sounded more like 1 and a, 2 and a, 3 and a, 4 and a. So we have all these, you can mesh them in together into whole notes or half notes. You can leave them quarter notes. You can divide each beat up however you want, and you can take a quarter note, make it 2 16th notes and an eighth note, as long as you divide it up. It's all these different combinations that give you the different rhythms and possibilities. And that's generally true. When that's the kind of thing that's going on, dividing all of these notes into 2 and things, then we call that simple meter. Compound meter, on the other hand, tends to divide the beat into 3, like this. And notice that we have a stressed followed by an unstressed beat, but instead of dividing those into 2, we have divided those into 3. So ba da 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 ba da 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 da. Generally, these are time signatures that end in 8, like 3/8, 6/8, 9/8, 12/8. It just means that there are 6 beats, but those beats are falling on the 8th note. And really, there may be 6 beats, but there are only 2 stresses. That's kind of what makes compound meter a little weird. So, for example, in 6/8, there'll be a stressed accent on the first 8th note, and then an unstressed one on the 4th 8th note. And then there's unequal meters. This is kind of complicated, sort of 20th century stuff, but unequal meters just means there's one beat that's been divided into 3 and another beat that's been divided into 2. For example, 5/8, which would mean 5 beats. The 8th note represents that beat, so there are 5 eighth notes in every measure. The first 3 will be grouped together, and the last 2 would be grouped together. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Or the opposite of that. The first two would be grouped together and the last three would be grouped together. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It is up to the notator, the composer, the whoever to give you good clues on how you want your beats and accents arranged in an unequal meter. Usually you can tell by how they are beamed together. When they're being beamed together, then you can use that as a guideline for, what is grouped together and what is not. So a triplet is just a group of three where there would otherwise be a group of two. For example, instead of splitting any given quarter note into two eighth notes, you instead split it into three, and that would be an eighth note triplet, which would go in 4 4 1 2 3 and a 4. So that third beat has been made into a triplet instead of just dividing it into two eighth notes. Same thing if you took an eighth note and divided it instead of into two 16th notes, divided it instead into three, it would go 1 and 2 and 3 and then a 4. We're putting three notes into a space normally reserved for two. A doublet is splitting a note by two where you would normally have split it by three. And by normally split it by three, I'm talking a compound meter. For example, 6/8, which is going along ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. If you suddenly decided to group those by two instead of grouping them by three, so ba-da-da-da-da, ba-da-da-da-da, then that would be called a doublet. Triplets, you group the three notes together and then you generally write a 3 above them. Doublets, you group the two notes together and generally write a 2 above them. All right, so to review, different notes represent different amounts of different numbers of beats that go into them. A whole note will generally have 4 beats if you're in 4/4 time. A half note has half the value of a whole note. Quarter note has half the value of a half note, just like your fractions. Dotted notes have the value of that note plus half. So a dotted quarter note has the same value as 3 eighth notes, and a dotted eighth note would have the same value as 3 16th notes, etc. A meter is the pattern of stressed and unstressed accents that are put onto these beats, onto these pulses. And each repetition of that pattern equals a measure. And we signify these in music with a meter signature, also known as a time signature. In these, if you're looking at these on a piece of music, the top number is going to be the number of beats in that pattern, and the bottom number is going to represent what note value, quarter note, eighth note, or whatever, it represents that beat. So that beat will in 4/4. That first 4, the top 4 in your time signature, means that there are 4 beats in every recurrence of our rhythmic pattern, 4 beats in every measure, which is congruent to our rhythmic pattern. And the bottom 4, or that last 4, if you're just saying it, means that the quarter note will represent that beat. So each beat, it lasts the length of a quarter note. Simple meter is when we divide these into two. Quarter notes become eighth notes become 16th notes. What we decide to divide and by how much gives us, all our rhythmic options in music. Compound meter is when we're taking these beats and instead of dividing them into two, we divide them into three. For example, 6/8, 9/8, where you're thinking of something going ba da 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 da, where there's a stressed and unstressed pattern that's then divided into three instead of just being divided into two. Unequal meters, combinations of simple and compound, like 5/8 or 7/8. One of these beats is going to be divided into three, and one of them is going to be divided into two, or what have you, depending on the case. A triplet is dividing any note into three where you would otherwise divide it into two. A doublet is taking one of these beats in compound or unequal meter that is divided into 3 and instead dividing it into 2. And they are usually represented by writing a 3 over 3 notes that are beamed together, or writing a 2 over 2 notes that are beamed together. And so that's the basics of rhythm. I hope this was helpful. As always, please feel free to contact us. Thanks.
For questions or comments,